All right, good morning, everyone. You may remember from a couple of weeks ago, we were looking at the 144,000 Israelites, the first fruits of Israel, and they were being divinely carried away at the start of the Great Tribulation. They were being taken to a place called Bozrah, which means sheepfold. So the 144,000 are taken to Bozrah. There they are nourished, they're fed, they're protected. They're hidden away for 1,260 days of the Great Tribulation there in this place called Bozrah. Also, at the end of the Great Tribulation, we know there's going to be this battle at this place called Bozrah. And in this battle, the Lord will slay his enemies and will have his day of vengeance there in Bozrah. Have you ever wondered what brings the antichrist and his army to Bozrah? Do they suddenly discover the location of the 144,000 and then they go to Bozrah to kill the remnant of Israel that are hiding out there? Well, we're going to look at several passages this morning that address that situation. And I think you'll be able to form a pretty good opinion on how they get there. But we're going to start this morning with just a brief review of some things that we've covered over the last weeks. Over the last several weeks, I've been laying out the case for the events of the 70th week to unfold as I have them laid out here on our 70th week diagram. Of significant importance is that the day of the Lord's wrath, the Great Tribulation, it will start at the sixth seal in the third year of the 70th week. The day of wrath will begin on or about on the spring feast of first fruits. First fruits is the feast day that's implemented by the Old Covenant, by the law, to commemorate the firstborn of Israel being divinely led out of Egypt, the land of Egypt. Well, very similar to that, the 144,000 first fruits of Israel will also be divinely led out of Jerusalem, which Revelation chapter 11 tells us is mystically called, mystically known as Egypt. The Antichrist armies will attack Jerusalem. The abomination that causes desolation will take place there in Jerusalem. And the wound of the sword is given to the Antichrist. So the 144,000, they are divinely nourished, protected in Bozrah for 1,260 days of the Great Tribulation. 1,260 days later on the calendar will land on the fall feast of Yom Kippur. Historically, this day, Yom Kippur, also known as the Day of Atonement, is a day when lambs, rams, goats, and bulls were sacrificed to atone for the land and the people of Israel. On the Day of Atonement, in the 7th year of the 70th week, there's going to be a huge battle involving the Lord and his army of 200 million fiery angels. The Lord will go to battle in Bozrah. And the men, we are told, who are killed in this battle will be a great sacrifice. And they'll be sacrificed as though they themselves were lambs, rams, goats, and bulls. This battle in Bozrah is also the day of vengeance for the Lord. Well, what will the Lord accomplish by killing his enemies there at Bozrah? According to Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 43, he will avenge the blood of his servants. He will render vengeance on his adversaries, and this great sacrifice will atone for his land and for the people of Israel. The land and the people of Israel will have fallen under judgment during the Great Tribulation. The Lord will atone for them when he returns to this battle. This battle ending, which brings about the end of the Great Tribulation, will take place at the sounding of the sixth trumpet. Why? How do we know that? Prophet Daniel wanted to know the outcome of these events, this great tribulation. He wasn't told. It remained a mystery to him. But Revelation chapter 10, we know the outcome of the great tribulation is revealed at the sixth trumpet. The Antichrist is killed, according to Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, when something known as a complete decreed destruction is poured out on the Antichrist. So much will be happening at the sixth trumpet. Look at what the sixth trumpet battle represents. The sixth trumpet battle of Revelation chapter 9 is also the Battle of Bozrah, referenced in Isaiah 34 and 63. It is the great sacrifice battle of Ezekiel 39. It is the threshing from the Euphrates River to the Nile River that's mentioned in Isaiah 27:12. It is the slaughter of the Midianites mentioned in Isaiah chapters 9, chapter 10, and also Psalm 83. And it is the complete decreed destruction mentioned in Daniel 9:27 and Isaiah chapter 10. So what is this complete decreed destruction that the prophets speak of? To understand what it is, we're going to follow the paper trail of evidence that the prophets have left for us. Start with Daniel 9:27. That's where it's mentioned. The angel Gabriel is telling Daniel, he's describing the Antichrist. He says, the Antichrist will commit this abomination that leads to desolation. And the reign of Antichrist will continue even until a complete decreed destruction is poured out on the one who makes desolate. That's referring to the Antichrist. The complete decreed destruction is the event that brings the Antichrist to an end. So the prophet Isaiah elaborates on this complete decreed destruction in Isaiah chapter 10, verse 23. For a complete destruction, one that is decreed, the Lord God of hosts will execute in the midst of the whole land. Make sure you see the connection here. The complete decreed destruction is a battle which the Lord himself will execute. And 3 verses later, here in Isaiah, he tells us more about the battle. He says, the Lord of hosts will arouse a scourge against him like the slaughter of Midian at the rock of Oreb. This battle, this complete decreed destruction, it's going to be a scourge like the slaughter of Midian at the rock of Oreb. Huge clues are given to us there. Twice in the history of Israel, once under Moses and once again under Gideon, the Midianites came into Israel and led the people of Israel astray spiritually. And the people of Israel worshiped the false gods of the Midianites, and they brought great judgment upon themselves for doing so. The Antichrist and his kingdom will be the third iteration of the Midianites that will once again lead the people of Israel astray. Moses and Gideon were the deliverers from Midian in Israel's past. But in the 70th week, the Lord himself will be Israel's deliverer. Both previous times in Israel's history when these Middle Eastern nations of the Midianites were destroyed, both times when the Midianites were destroyed, trumpets and fire were part of the battle that destroyed the Midianites. When Moses and the Israelites, when they sounded a trumpet, which signaled the alarm to go to battle, all of the cities in which Midian lived were burned with fire. And you can find that in Numbers chapter 31. Trumpet sounded, the cities of Midian were burned with fire. When Gideon destroyed the Midianites, the Israelites also sounded trumpets for battle. When the trumpets sounded, they broke the pitchers that concealed and then revealed their torches of fire, and then the Midianites and the rest of the sons of the east were killed. When Gideon killed the kings of the Midianites, he removed the crescent symbols, a sign of their religion, the crescent gold moon symbols that were hanging around their camels' necks. So, what happens at the sixth trumpet battle? The sixth angel sounds a trumpet, and 1/3 of the people are killed by fire, smoke, and brimstone. There will be trumpets and fire at the sixth trumpet battle, which will once again destroy the Midianites. Pattern equals prophecy. Isaiah chapter 10 connects the complete decreed destruction to the slaughter of the Midianites. Isaiah also mentions the battle of Midian in chapter 9. The battle of Midian, which is the complete decreed destruction, It is the battle that immediately precedes the implementation of the kingdom of Christ, where the government is upon his shoulders. Think of Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. Unto us a son is given, a child is born, a son is given. Government will be upon his shoulders. So we know that the implementation of Christ's kingdom is declared at the seventh trumpet there in Revelation. The battle of the sixth trumpet immediately precedes that. So this battle of Midian, it is the event that drew our attention to Psalm 83 last week. Psalm 83. Deal with them as with Midian, as with Sisera and Jabin at the torrent of Kishon, who were destroyed at Endor, who became as dung for the ground. Make their nobles like Oreb and Zeb, and all their princes like Zebah and Zalmunna. Psalm 83 is a prayer by the people of Israel. God's treasured ones, the 144,000, they're hidden away in Bozrah. It is the remnant of Israel, and they're surrounded by these nations that want to wipe Israel off the map. And the Israelites cry out, deal with them as with Midian. Isaiah tells us the slaughter of Midian going to be the complete decreed destruction. So the psalmist, as he's writing this psalm, as he's praying this prayer, he's praying for the Lord to bring about this complete decreed destruction of their enemies. We're going to tie this together. We're going to start looking for some word clues here. I've highlighted the phrase, dung on the ground. I'm sure most of you know that dung is a reference to excrement, as in animal waste. The prayer of Psalm 83 is literally asking for the Lord to slaughter Israel's enemies and then have their dead, decaying bodies strewn about on the ground as though it's animal excrement. So the Hebrew word that is used here for dung is domen. Domen. If you look in Strong's Concordance, it's entry H, as in Hebrew, H1828, 1828. So this word for dung, domen, it's used 6 times in the Old Testament. Every time it's used the same way, to describe dead, decaying bodies on the ground that have become like excrement, like animal waste. Now, you may be thinking, why are we making such a big deal over animal excrement? Believe it or not, that phrase, dung on the ground, is a word clue that helps us explain this complete decreed destruction. And the psalmist also gives us some additional clues by mentioning Oreb and Zeb, Zebah, and Zalmunna. They were previous Midianite kings and princes, and the deaths of these previous Midianite kings will illustrate the types of death that are awaiting the Antichrist and his henchmen. So, the coming destruction of the Antichrist and his armies said to be a decreed destruction. Who made this decree? When was the decree made? And to whom is this decree of destruction applicable? Well, Daniel first mentioned it in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. So we're going to go back and we're going to look for some clues in the book of Daniel. What would you think if I told you the decrees for destruction were given by kings that lived 2,500 years ago? Now, the kings and the empires over which they presided have been gone for 2.5 millennia. Why in the world would these decrees from these ancient kings and ancient empires, why would they have any significance in the 70th week? And how do these ancient decrees come back into effect? Well, Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, the statue, the stone that comes and destroys it. We've covered that before. But when the stone representing Christ's kingdom arrive, it will strike the statue, and then Babylon, Medo-Persia, and the Greek empires that make up part of this statue, which represents the Antichrist empires, we're told they all come crashing down. These empires all come crashing down at the same time. Daniel chapter 7, the previous empires are represented by different beasts. We're told the first 3 beasts or empires, they cease to exist, but they're given an extension of life in the 70th week. And of course, as we've covered before, Revelation chapter 13 tells us these first 3 beasts from Daniel chapter 7, they come back, but they're all rolled into one beast, which is the kingdom of the Antichrist. So the 70th week is when these kingdoms get their extension of life. What does it mean for the previous kingdoms to have an extension of life in the 70th week? Obviously, the people living 2,500 years ago won't get an extension of life. They're going to be dead and gone, never to return. So what part of these previous kingdoms gets an extension of life? The religions, the customs, and the laws of these previous empires get an extension of life, and it's going to be revived in the 70th week. How can we know that? We're going to compare what was happening in Daniel's day to what will be happening, what we know will be happening from Scripture in the 70th week. And the first example is one that we've covered several times. The ancient Babylonians said God does not dwell among mortal flesh, and that tenet of Babylonian religion will be revived in the 70th week. Muslims today don't believe that Jesus is the Christ, sent by the Father to dwell among men. John calls it the spirit of the Antichrist. The spirit of the Antichrist will be prevalent, abundantly present in the 70th week. That's one example of what will be revived in the 70th week. A second example of the Babylonian religion receiving an extension of life comes from Daniel chapter 3. King Nebuchadnezzar made this golden image of himself, and at specific times during the day, musical instruments would play, calling everyone to come and worship the image of the king. A command was given by the king, worship the image of the king or be put to death. This very thing will happen again in the 70th week. The false prophet, who will cause the world to worship the Antichrist, he will tell those who dwell on the earth to make an image for the beast. Those that do not worship the image of the beast will be killed. In the 70th week, during the reign of the Antichrist, there will be a call to worship, a musical call to worship. And did you know that's already a Muslim practice that's in place in Islamic nations? 5 times a day, Muslims will hear the musical call to worship and they will face Mecca and bow down and worship. Well, in the 70th week, everyone will be required to bow down and worship the image of the beast. You see, Nebuchadnezzar's decree in Babylon 2,500 years ago will be the Antichrist decree in the 70th week. And you know the rest of the story. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they refused to bow down and they were thrown into the fiery furnace. And the Lord safely delivers them through the fire. And that event, the Lord saving these 3 men, it is what opens the eyes of King Nebuchadnezzar to the true God who has delivered these men. And because of this divine deliverance that Nebuchadnezzar himself witnessed, he issues a decree. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who's able to deliver in this way. You see on the screen there where it says rubbish heap. This comes from the Hebrew word nevalu. Nevalu. If you want to look it up in Strong's Concordance, it's entry H5122, 5122. The phrase rubbish heap is not the most accurate translation in conveying the message that's being left here. The King James Version translates it as a dunghill. Your houses shall be made a dunghill. So there was this practice in ancient Babylon for people who were not of royalty. They would be buried under their houses, and the crypts or tombs that contained their bodily remains, they would be buried under the floor of the house. And so what's being said is, everything you possess, your house, your property, even your bodies, it's all going to be left as a dung heap spread out on the field. You will dissolve away to the elements, never to be seen again or remembered. What did the writer of Psalm 83 pray? Deal with them like Midian. Leave them like dung on the ground. The kingdom of the Antichrist, when it is destroyed, will dissolve away like chaff on the threshing room floor, never to be seen again, never to be remembered. Also, I want you to take note, the people in this decree of destruction will be torn limb from limb. We're going to see that again. The same king, Nebuchadnezzar, who issued the first decree ordering people to bow down and worship the image, he also issued the second decree. If you speak any offense against the true God of Israel, you will be dismembered and your houses will be left as dung heaps. Does Scripture record anyone saying anything offensive about the God of Israel? Revelation chapter 13, verse 6 speaks of the Antichrist doing this very thing. And he, the Antichrist, opened his mouth in blasphemies against God to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle. Any nation, people, or tongue that speaks an offense against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, torn apart, left as dung heaps on the ground. Look at the amazing irony that's being described here. During the 70th week, the Antichrist establishes his Islamic caliphate, and he resurrects these anti-Jewish, anti-Christian decrees from the Babylonian Empire. The decrees of Babylon, as part of the empire, are given an extension of life. And ironically, the Lord will hold the Antichrist and those in his kingdom who've spoken offensively against God, he will hold them accountable to the decreed destruction, being dismembered and left as dung heaps. We'll follow up on that more. There's a second decree that I want to show you, and it comes from the Medo-Persian Empire, which followed the Babylonian Empire. King Cyrus, you've probably heard that name. It was King Cyrus who was over the Median and the Persian Empire that defeated Babylon and took over the Babylonian Empire. King Cyrus released the Jews to return to their homeland, and he, King Cyrus, issued a decree for them to go home and to rebuild the Jewish temple. And from our time in our study several weeks ago in the book of Zechariah, I mentioned to you that Joshua, the son of Nun, he was the first high priest, and Zerubbabel was the first governor of Judah. So the first high priest and the first governor of Judah after the Babylonian exile. And the combined efforts of Joshua and Zerubbabel, these two men started the construction of the second temple. And their work on the temple was interrupted by a Persian governor by the name of Tatnai, Governor Tatnai. He was questioning their authority to rebuild the temple. So Tatnai was a governor in a province which is said to be beyond the river Euphrates. So from a Persian standpoint, from the king, this would mean Tatnai would have been a governor of the province which was west of the Euphrates River. And west of the Euphrates River is within the future land area of land that was promised by God to the descendants of Israel. So Governor Tatnai, he wrote to King Darius. King Darius is the son-in-law of the previous King Cyrus. He writes this letter to find out if in fact the Jews had permission to rebuild the temple. King Darius went looking and he found this previous decree that had been issued by King Cyrus that authorized the construction of the temple. Ezra chapter 6 records the correspondence between Governor Tatnai and King Cyrus. Starting in verse 6, Ezra 6, verse 6. Now, therefore, Tatnai, governor of the province beyond the river, Shethar, Bozrah, and all your colleagues, the officials of the provinces beyond the river, keep away from there. Leave this work on the house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews rebuild the house of God on its site. Because of Governor Tatnai's hatred for the Jews, he went poking his nose into matters that were not his business. And so not only did King Darius respond and say, stay away from the Jews, let them alone as they construct the temple, he also said this, I issue a decree concerning what you are to do for these elders of Judah in the rebuilding of this house of God. The full cost is to be paid to these people from the royal treasury out of the taxes of the provinces beyond the river and that without delay. So what's being said here? Governor Tatnai, the king says, I decree that the cost of rebuilding this temple is going to be financed by your treasury. The silver and the gold in your treasury, give it to the Jews so they can build their temple. So you think about it, it's kind of funny. He goes poking around and he says, not only do you let him alone, use your money in your province there in the land between west of the Euphrates to build this temple. Joshua the high priest and Zerubbabel the governor, they build the second temple, and it's financed from the treasury of the surrounding nations. That's Ezra chapter 6. A couple of weeks back, we looked at Zechariah chapter 6. Jesus, the righteous branch, will come, and he's going to combine the two offices, Joshua and Zerubbabel, high priest, governor, or high priest and king. Jesus, the branch, we're told, Zechariah chapter 6, he will be the one to rebuild the millennial temple. The gold and the silver needed for building, constructing the millennial temple, it's going to be coming in the form of plunder taken from the nations surrounding Israel when the Lord returns to complete this decreed destruction. I want to make sure you get what I'm saying here. The gold and the surrounding nations was used to finance or used to build the components of the second temple under Joshua and Zerubbabel. The gold and the silver from the surrounding nations in the 70th week, it's going to be used to build the millennial temple. I wanted you to see that pattern of prophecy there. But King Darius goes on to say in this passage, just 3 verses later, he says, and I issued a decree that any man who violates this edict, a timber shall be drawn from his house, and he shall be impaled on it, and his house shall be made a refuse heap. Again, dunghill. On account of this, may the God who has caused his name to dwell there overthrow any king or people who attempts to change it so as to destroy this house of God in Jerusalem. Similar language again is used by King Darius as it was by King Nebuchadnezzar. But in this decree, instead of dismemberment, bodily dismemberment, we have bodily impalement. And this decree of destruction is not for saying offensive things against the Lord. It's for changing or attempting to destroy the temple, which is the house of God. And that would certainly be true of the Antichrist in the 70th week. The Apostle Paul, his second letter to the Thessalonians, he says this about the Antichrist, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes a seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. King Darius says in his decree, any people or king that does these things should have their kingdom overthrown. That's exactly what the Lord will do when he returns to the 6th trumpet battle. The Lord will overthrow the kingdom of the Antichrist in the 6th trumpet battle. And according to Revelation chapter 11, verse 15, the 7th trumpet sounds and it says, the kingdom of this world, meaning the Antichrist kingdom, will become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ. The Lord, in fulfilling this decree, overthrows the kingdom of the Antichrist and establishes his kingdom at the 7th trumpet. The Lord will execute the complete decree destruction of the Antichrist and his kingdom. The Lord will combine the offices of high priest and king, and he will combine them into one office. He will rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, and it will be rebuilt from the plunder of the surrounding nations west of the Euphrates River. The history of the Israelites has set the pattern for the future of the Israelites. Quick summary of our 2 decrees of destruction. Our first decree of destruction, Daniel 3:29. Blasphemy against God by a people or a nation will result in the dismemberment of the bodies with remains left in the field as dung heaps. On the second decree was from the book of Ezra chapter 6. The desecration of God's house will result in the impaling of bodies and the remains left in the field as dung heaps. Their kingdom is to be overthrown. Dismemberment and impaling with bodies left to rot in the field like dung heap. That is the form of destruction that is decreed for anyone violating these two ancient decrees. Earlier, I told you the psalmist in Psalm 83 was praying for the decreed destruction of Israel's enemies. Let's go back to our previous slide, and I will show you why that is. The psalmist wants God to deal with these nations as Midian. He's asking God to enforce this decree of destruction upon his people. Blasphemy against God and the destruction of his temple brings about bodily dismemberment and impaling, and bodies being left as dung heaps on the ground. The psalmist, Psalm 83, he lists the names of these men. He lists them by name. He says, Lord, what happened to these specific men, do the same to those who surround us and want to wipe us off the map. Look at the examples given. Sisera and Jabin, they were two Canaanite commanders. Sisera had a stake driven through his temple into the ground. That's listed in Judges chapter 4. That would count as impalement. Jabin, the king of the Canaanites, while we're not told exactly how he dies, we're told that his body was physically destroyed in death. Oreb and Zeb were two Midianite leaders who were decapitated by Israelites from the tribe of Ephraim, which is listed in Judges chapter 7. There's the dismemberment. The writer of Psalm 83 is praying for God to kill the nations that are trying to wipe out the remnant there in Bozrah. Impale them like Sisera and Jabin. Dismember them like Oreb and Zeb. And God, let their bodies lie on the ground like piles of dung that will dissolve away, never to be remembered. Zebah and Zalmunna, also Midianite kings, were killed by the sword of Gideon. We're not told, but they were possibly dismembered, as were Oreb and Zeb. And after these two kings are killed, Gideon removes the gold crescent symbols from their camels' necks. Verse 12 of Psalm 83 says these nations that are listed here and will be destroyed, they want to possess the land of Israel for themselves. Here's what I can tell you about the coming king of the Antichrist in the 70th week that will be destroyed by Christ when he returns. The kingdom of the Antichrist will be comprised of Middle Eastern nations surrounding the nation of Israel, and this kingdom of the Antichrist will mimic the actions of the ancient Midianites. These nations will have a crescent moon as a symbol of their faith. The kingdom of the Antichrist will want to possess the land of Israel, and they will want to wipe out Israel as a nation. The kingdom of the Antichrist will deny that Jesus is the Son of God who was sent by the Father, and that sounds a lot like the Middle East as we know it today. This ancient group of Midianite people in the Middle East, they stand ready to be assembled once again in a caliphate. The Midianites are waiting for their Mahdi to arrive and assemble them. God's word tells us so much about what is to come by the way of the Midianites. There's one more Midian reference that I want us to track down. It comes from Habakkuk chapter 3. I saw the tents of Cushan under distress. The tent curtains of the land of Midian were trembling. In all of Scripture, I believe Habakkuk chapter 3 offers the clearest details of what will happen when the Lord returns to Bozrah. Habakkuk chapter 3, it's a lengthy passage, and the opening verses of chapter 3 describe with great detail the cataclysmic events that are happening to the earth as the Lord and his angels return. We're going to cover those momentarily, but I want to go straight to the heart of the matter. Let me share with you Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 12 to 14. In indignation you marched through the earth. In anger you trampled the nations. You went forth for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You struck the head of the house of evil to lay him open from thigh to neck. You pierced with his own spears the head of his throngs. They stormed in to scatter us. Their exultation was like those who devoured the oppressed in secret. So, in this passage, the Lord himself is on earth. He's not judging from on high. He's here on earth. He's here, he's angry, and he's trampling the nations. Why is he here? He's come forth for the salvation of his covenant people, Israel. The focus on who is being saved by the Lord when he returns is tightened just a little bit more. The coming for the salvation of his anointed. That's why he's coming. The word anointed is the Hebrew word Mashiach. Mashiach. If you want to look it up, Strong's Concordance, H4899, 4899. Mashiach means a person or a group of people who are specifically chosen. In the Old Testament, a high priest or the king of Israel was said to be Mashiach. They were anointed. Here, the Mashiach is a group, a specific group of people. Earlier, Psalm 83, the group praying to be rescued was the faithful remnant, the 144,000 who had been hidden, sheltered away, and protected for 1,260 days. I believe this passage in Habakkuk chapter 3 is also referring to the 144,000, just like Psalm 83. You'll see why in just a minute. We're told in this passage, the Lord strikes the head of the house of evil. Initially, this might sound like a group or a conglomerate of people in this house of evil. It's not. It's just one man. It says to lay him open from thigh to neck. It's speaking of one man. So the original text, when it speaks of laying him open from thigh to neck, it speaks of, the phrase is uncovering his foundation. The implication is that when this individual is opened up from thigh to neck, his entrails, his foundation, his entrails are being spilled out as his body is opened up. Consider something very similar. On the ancient Day of Atonement, the high priest would gut, that is, lay open the sacrificial animal who was being sacrificed. And as he would lay open the sacrificial animals, he would remove the entrails. And I believe a graphic and similar event is taking place here. This is a picture of Jesus, the blood avenger, atoning for the people and the land by slaughtering the Antichrist and his army. It says, you pierced with his own spears the head of his throngs. Verse 14, it is translated, as you read the various translations, it's translated so many different ways that it makes it difficult to understand exactly what's happening. But I think the English Standard Version, ESV, is most clearly what illustrates what's happening here. Let me change it to the ESV translation for you. You pierced with his own arrows the heads of his warriors, who came in like a whirlwind to scatter me, rejoicing as if to devour the poor in secret. The warriors of the Antichrist will have their heads pierced by their own arrows. This is speaking literally of men having their heads impaled. The writer of Psalm 83 asked for the Lord to do to them what was done to Sisera. Sisera had his head impaled by a tent peg. The decree for destruction from King Darius calls for the death by impalement. And I believe Habakkuk is telling us of the decree of destruction being fulfilled. So this last part of verse 14 is huge. The warriors who will be impaled, they are the ones who have come in to scatter us, those that are hidden there. The us in this passage are the anointed ones, the Mashiach. These warriors have come in to scatter the anointed ones. And it says the warriors are exulting, literally rejoicing as they storm in upon the anointed ones. So, why would the Antichrist warriors be rejoicing as they storm in on the remnant? Well, for 1,260 days, the Antichrist soldiers, they either didn't know where the remnant was hiding or for some reason didn't believe they could get to them. But now they have found the remnant and they're exulting because they're ready to come in and wipe them out. They're coming in to devour, it says to devour, consume the poor the oppressed in secret. This is translated in a way that makes it somewhat confusing. It sounds as though it is the soldiers, the warriors, the Antichrist soldiers that are trying to stealthily and secretly, quietly come in and kill the remnant of Israel. That's not what's being said here. The in secret is referring to the people of Israel. The word translated in secret is mishtar. Mishtar. Hebrews entry 4565 in the concordance. 4565. Now, mishtar is more commonly translated as secret place or hiding place, and especially, Strong says, especially a hiding place of protection. Psalm 83, the remnant of Israel were said to be the hidden ones, the treasured ones who had been hidden away. The idea is that these warriors were rejoicing that they had found the anointed ones. They found those who had been hidden away in a secret place, and they were storming in to destroy the remnant of Israel. They were intent on wiping them out as a nation. They've discovered the secret place. The word translated devour here, we've talked about this before, it's the Hebrew word achal. The Antichrist, the worthless shepherd of Zechariah chapter 11, verse 16, he said to devour the sheep, achal, devour the people of Israel. Malachi chapter 3, verse 11, we're told the Lord goes quickly to the temple and he rebukes the devourer. He will strike the Antichrist and give him the wound of the sword. So the same word, akal, is being used here. The soldiers, the warriors, want to devour the anointed remnant that are there in hiding. And Habakkuk chapter 3 gives the narrative of the Lord returning and saving his people, laying open the body of the leader of the enemies, and the opposing warriors are impaled on their own arrows. This is a rather obscure passage in Habakkuk chapter 3. The Lord's getting into a battle. He's destroying some warriors who've come in on his anointed ones. Can we be sure, or can we know with more certainty, that this passage in Habakkuk chapter 3 is the Lord returning to Bozrah? I think so, but I appreciate your skepticism. I've told you before about chapter 32, the Song of Moses. This is the chapter where the Israelites, they were supposed to commit this entire chapter to memory. And I'm going to read it. It's lengthy, but I'm going to read it because there's some things I want to be fresh on our minds. Indeed, I lift up my hand to heaven and say, as I live forever, if I sharpen my flashing sword and my hand takes hold on justice, I will render vengeance on my adversaries and I will repay those who hate me. I will make my arrows drunk with blood, and my sword will devour flesh, with the blood of the slain and the captives from the long-haired leaders of the enemy. Rejoice, O nations, with his people, for he will avenge the blood of his servants, and will render vengeance on his adversaries, and will atone for his land and his people. Very briefly, I want to remind you of the tie-in to the sixth trumpet and the Battle of Bozrah. Revelation chapter 10, Daniel chapter 12, both had the angelic visitors come, raising their hands and swearing by him who lives forever. The mystery, the outcome of the great tribulation revealed at the sixth trumpet. The angelic visitors hold their hands to heaven, swearing by him who lives forever. It's pointing us here to Deuteronomy chapter 32, pointing us back here to the return of Jesus on the Lord on his day of judgment. It is Jesus who's raising his hand saying, as I live forever. And according to Deuteronomy 32, Jesus will be avenging the blood of his servants and having his day of vengeance against his adversaries. He's taking hold of his flashing sword as he delivers justice, avenging the blood of those martyred in the 70th week. So, the narrative of Deuteronomy chapter 32, it continues into chapter 32, into chapter 33, and Moses describes the route the Lord will take as he returns for the battle at the sixth trumpet. Here in Deuteronomy chapter 33, we learn about this path the Lord's going to take. The Lord came from Sinai and dawned on them from Seir. He shone forth from Mount Paran, and he came from the midst of 10,000 holy ones. At his right hand there was flashing lightning for them. Isaiah 63, the battle of Bozrah, that is where the Lord's clothing is bloodied it's stained by the blood of those he slays. It takes place in Bozrah in the land of Edom. So the area, I'm going to highlight an area there on your map, that is the ancient land of Edom. And the village of Bozrah is located at the southern end of the Dead Sea. According to Moses, the Lord will be moving north from Sinai, coming to Mount Seir, Mount Paran. So look at the map. Here is Mount Sinai. Here's Mount Seir. Here's Mount Paran. The people of this narrative are yet further north. How do we know? Because it says, he shone forth from Mount Paran. He dawned on them from Mount Seir. So this is being written as though Jesus, as he's coming in his brilliant glory, he's going to be like the rising of the morning sun. He crests over the mountains of Seir and Paran, and he dawns on them. So it's described as he's the sun rising in the morning over these mountains. Notice the reference to 10,000 holy ones. We talked about this weeks ago. Myrios, a myriad, has the number 10,000 assigned to it. 10,000 times 10,000, 100 million. He's coming from among his myriad, 10,000. He and his cadre of angels become visible to those who are north of this location who are watching. It says Jesus has something flashing like lightning in his right hand. Deuteronomy 32:41. He has his sharpened, polished sword in his hand. His sword is ready to slay his enemies. And we can tell from the description of the travel given thus far that the Lord and his angels are heading in the direction of Bozrah, where the anointed, the Mashiach, are hiding. But can we be sure that Deuteronomy 33:2 is speaking of the Lord coming to kill the Antichrist and his army? And is that related to Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 12 to 14 that we just read? I think we can, because we're going to compare some word clues here in Deuteronomy with the opening chapters of Habakkuk chapter 3. In the opening verses of chapter 3 of Habakkuk, the prophet describes the Lord's arrival prior to that battle that I just read to you. See if you see any similarities between our passages. God comes from Teman and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covers the heavens, and the earth is full of his praise. His radiance is like the sunlight. He has rays flashing from his hand, and there is the hiding of his power. So Teman is a village in the ancient land of Edom. It's south of Bozrah, but it's north of Mount Paran. You can see Teman right there. Notice this passage also indicates the Lord is moving north from Mount Paran, and he's moving north past Teman. He's coming from Teman. So the prophet Habakkuk, as he's describing his description, he's giving a description of the Lord. He doesn't say that the Lord shone on them or he dawned on them like the sun. He's much more direct. He says, the radiance of the Lord is like sunlight. So the Lord is moving north of Paran, north of Teman, and he's still heading north. What do you think he might be heading to? Where do you think he might be going? Habakkuk also describes a flashing in the hand of the Lord. The flashing in the Lord's hand is his source of power. The Lord of himself, he's going to be radiant like the sun. In his right hand, he has that polished sword. I believe the polished sword is reflecting the radiance of the Lord's glory. And to the eye, that reflection of the sun looks like a flash of lightning. This passage from Moses, Deuteronomy 33, parallels Habakkuk 3 as the Lord is on his way to Bozrah to destroy the Antichrist and his army. This is the Lord being revealed from heaven with his angels of fire as described 2 Thessalonians 1:7. Habakkuk takes several verses to describe these cataclysmic events that unfold as the Lord is being revealed. We're going to continue reading in Habakkuk chapter 3. Before him goes pestilence, and plague comes after him. He stood and surveyed the earth. He looked and startled the nations. Yes, the perpetual mountains were shattered, and the ancient hills collapsed. His ways are everlasting. I saw the tents of Cushan under distress. The tent curtains of the land of Midian were trembling. So mountains and hills are being shattered and collapsing. I think it's safe to say that there will be some major earthquakes occurring in conjunction with the appearance of the Lord. Cushan is under distress, and the curtains of the tents of Midian are shaking. So on our map, the land of Midian, I'll highlight it there. That is the land of Midian. It is in the northwest corner of the Sinai Peninsula. The land of Cush is over in Egypt on the left side of the screen. These two land areas, we're told, are shaking under distress because they are opposite sides of the path that the Lord and his angels will take upon his entrance. And Habakkuk gives us even more to appreciate how these events are going to unfold. Did the Lord rage against the rivers, or was your anger against the rivers, or was your wrath against the sea, that you rode on your horses on your chariots of salvation? Your bow was made bare, the rods of a chastisement were sworn. You cleaved the earth with rivers. The prophet asks some questions of the Lord as he's seeing what's unfolding here. It appears to Habakkuk that the Lord is angry at these bodies of water. Why would that appear to be the case? So the Lord and his angels and their chariots of fire, they're coming in, sweeping over the water, and they're causing this great disruption on the surface of the water. Have you ever seen the low-flying supersonic jets over water and what it does to the surface of the water? Imagine having hundreds of millions of angels flying over the surface of these land areas. Their appearance, sweeping over the water, causes disturbance in the water. Notice the reference to the horses and the chariots. It aligns itself with the language of the sixth trumpet, Revelation 9. It says, the bow of the Lord was made bare, meaning that all of the arrows had been shot. The quiver of arrows had been emptied upon the enemy. The rods of chastisement were sworn. So the rods here are referring to the arrows. The New King James Version translation says, oaths were sworn over your arrows. The arrows are the fulfillment of the promises, the oaths that the Lord had made concerning the destruction of Israel's enemies. And it would also coincide with the impalement of the Lord's enemies as described in the decree of destruction. It says you cleave the earth with rivers. It's implying that the large bodies of water were raised up over the land. And I believe Habakkuk is describing a tsunami that will take place. And we're going to see more here in just a moment. The mountains saw you and quaked, and the downpour of water swept by. The deep uttered forth its voice, and it lifted high its hands. Sun and moon stood in their place, and they went away at the light of your arrows, at the radiance of your gleaming spear. The mountains are quaking, depicting earthquakes. Water is sweeping by on the land. The deep, meaning a large body of water, we're told, and in this case, I think it's the Red Sea at the bottom of the screen there. The body of water, we're told, lifted high its hands. Well, think of this. A tsunami that causes a tidal wave and the deep lifts its hands. Doesn't that just look like a big wave coming in, the deep raising its hands? We're told, I believe it's a tsunami-induced tidal wave as they sweep in over the water. The sun and the moon appear to stand still, and then they disappear completely at the brilliance of the Lord's coming. This is the path. This is the path of the Lord going north from Mount Sinai near the Red Sea, heading for the complete decreed destruction in Bozrah. Now, I want you to remember, at this time, there are also four angels who are bound at the Euphrates River in the north, who will be released at the sixth trumpet, and we're told they will begin appeasing God's wrath. Starting there, the threshing will start for them up at the Euphrates River. The battlefield of the sixth trumpet, it's huge, and And along with the destruction of 1/3 of mankind, there will be some major earth-shaking renovations being made to the planet as well when the Lord returns. Mountains are just going to dissolve away to nothing. And I believe these earth-changing events happening here in the Middle East, starting in the land of Israel at the sixth trumpet, I believe they are the start of the transformation that will take place on earth when the earth, we're told, will be made into a Garden of Eden-like situation for the millennial kingdom. This, I believe, is the start of that transformation. As we close this morning, and I apologize, I'll run over just a few minutes, but I want to remind you of some phrases that I showed you last week that speak of the return of Christ. We looked at Ezekiel 39, and we learned that these 4 events, which I have highlighted, all occur as a result of the battle of Ezekiel 39. I want to take a moment just to focus on one of these phrases, the restoring of fortunes. The people of Israel will have their fortunes restored to them after this battle of Ezekiel 39. Now, I've taken the better part of the last 2 weeks to show you connections between the battles of Ezekiel 39, Isaiah 9, 10, 34, 63, the sixth trumpet, Deuteronomy 32, and Psalm 83. These passages that I've listed are all describing the same battle, but each of those passages gives us a different facet of that same battle. Ezekiel 39 tells us the fortunes are restored after the battle. Psalm 83 gives us the names of the involved surrounding nations that encircle Israel and will be destroyed. Now, with that in mind, consider this passage from Joel chapter 3. For behold, in those days and at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Then I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my inheritance Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations, and they have divided up my land. The Lord restores the fortunes in conjunction with his battle, and we know which battle Joel is speaking of. He says he will gather the nations together and is doing so for the purpose of entering judgment against them. He's acting on behalf of his people whom these nations have scattered. They scattered the people of Israel and took their land. And Joel, the prophet Joel, through this chapter, he's calling out all these misdeeds that these surrounding nations have committed against the people and the land of Israel. And he continues in verse 11, chapter 3, verse 11. Hasten and come, all you surrounding nations, and gather yourselves there. Bring down, O Lord, your mighty ones. Let the nation be aroused and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat, for there I will sit to judge all the surrounding nations. So I want you to see the pattern of consistency across so many books of the Bible. Joel the prophet calls for the surrounding nations to gather in battle against the Lord. Those groups that are listed in Psalm 83, those are all the nations surrounding Israel that the Lord will call them together to go to battle against him. But look what else the prophet is telling us. Joel calls for the Lord to bring down his mighty ones. Who are the mighty ones that the Lord will bring down with him? Well, consider Psalm 103. Bless the Lord, O you his angels, you mighty ones, who do his word, obeying the voice of his word. In this battle with surrounding nations, after which the Lord restores his people's fortunes, in this battle to do that, he's going to bring with him his mighty angels to render this judgment. The surrounding nations, they do not know the thoughts of the Lord. They believe they have gathered to wipe out Israel as a nation, but they don't understand that he is gathering them. He's the one doing the gathering them like sheaves to the threshing floor. With his winnowing fork, the Lord will separate the wheat from the chaff. The wheat, Israel, will be brought into the barn. The chaff, the enemies of Israel, will be consumed with fire, never to be seen again. These passages all tie back to the decree of destruction that brings the kingdom of the Antichrist to an end. These are the nations surrounding Israel, running from the river Euphrates to the land of Egypt, the Nile River, that God will judge at the sixth trumpet. And, by the way, the Valley of Jehoshaphat. What is this Valley of Jehoshaphat that Joel mentions? What else does it tell us about this battle? What happens on the days following this battle? I hope you'll come back next week and we can talk more about these events taking place, because they're so important what takes place after the battle of the sixth trumpet. But as for this morning, thank you so much for coming. You are dismissed.